The sleek private jet gleamed under the morning sun, its polished surface reflecting the promise of luxury. Inside, the cabin exuded an atmosphere of opulence. Plush leather seats, soft lighting, and wooden accents that gave the space an air of quiet sophistication. The perfect setting for a first-class journey, yet beneath the surface, something simmered. James Williams, a man in his early 40s, boarded the aircraft with a calm, composed demeanor. His dark suit was tailored but understated, not the kind of flashy attire that screamed wealth. He had purposely chosen simple clothing, no designer labels or jewelry to signal his financial status. It was a deliberate choice. James preferred to blend in, not draw attention to himself. His quiet confidence was palpable as he moved through the cabin, but no one would have guessed that he owned the jet he was now traveling on. Lauren, the lead flight attendant, stood near the entrance, her gaze sweeping over the passengers as they boarded. She was a woman who prided herself on knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't. Over the years, she had perfected the art of judging people based on their appearance, classifying them into neat categories: VIPs and non-VIPs. She valued order, and part of that order involved knowing who deserved special treatment. When her eyes landed on James, a flicker of doubt passed over her face. His attire, while elegant, was far simpler than what she was accustomed to seeing in the upper echelons of wealthy travelers. He lacked the obvious signs of affluence. No flashy accessories, no extravagant designer suits. To Lauren, this made him an outlier, someone who didn't belong in this exclusive section. "Welcome aboard," Lauren said, her tone polite but clinical. She moved to greet each passenger with the same practiced warmth, though it was clear her smile wasn't as genuine when it came to James. "Excuse me, sir," she continued, her voice cool. "I believe you're in the wrong section." James looked up at her, his expression calm and measured. "This is my seat," he replied, his voice steady, showing no sign of the annoyance that Lauren's words were starting to stir. Lauren's smile remained, but it was thin, almost forced. "This area is reserved for our elite passengers," she said, her voice now laced with an edge. She gestured toward the back of the plane. "If you could please move to the rear, we'll make sure you're more comfortable there." The implication was unmistakable. James, dressed simply, wasn't someone who belonged in this part of the plane. He didn't fit the mold she had built in her mind of what a VIP should look like. To Lauren, anyone who wasn't wearing designer labels and flaunting their wealth didn't deserve the same treatment. James didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady. "I'm not moving," he said quietly, his voice calm but unwavering. Lauren's patience wore thin. She had dealt with unruly passengers before, but this felt different. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged by someone who seemed so ordinary. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized him further. "This is a VIP section," she reiterated, her voice sharp. "You're not a VIP." James met her gaze. "Check the list again," he said simply. Lauren hesitated for a moment, but the calm in his voice only irritated her more. She wasn't used to passengers who didn't immediately comply. "If you don't move," she said, louder now for others to hear, "I'll have to call security." James tilted his head slightly. "Call whoever you need to," he replied softly, "but I'm not moving." The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering quietly among themselves. Others pretended not to notice, but the discomfort was palpable. No one spoke up, but all of them were aware of what was happening. A subtle, ugly moment of discrimination that could no longer be ignored. Lauren's patience was wearing thin. She was a woman who thrived on control, and this situation was spiraling out of her grasp. She couldn't let this man, who didn't meet her idea of a VIP, defy her authority, especially not in front of the other passengers. She straightened her posture, folding her arms across her chest, and narrowed her eyes at James. "Sir, I'm not asking again," Lauren said, her tone harder now, a trace of frustration creeping into her voice. "You need to move to the back of the plane." The words were sharp, laced with an underlying judgment, but James didn't budge. His calmness was unnerving to her. Most people in his position would have apologized and complied, eager to avoid confrontation, but not James. His refusal only served to fuel Lauren's growing irritation. She had a set idea of how things were supposed to be, and James, because of his appearance, His manner and the color of his skin was challenging that. "I'm perfectly fine where I am," James replied, his voice smooth, but the strength behind it was undeniable. His gaze met hers with quiet determination. He was not going to be intimidated. He was not going to be pushed around simply because Lauren thought he didn't belong. "Maybe you didn't hear me," Lauren said, her tone more biting now. "This section is for elite passengers, people who can afford to sit here. You don't fit that profile." The words were harsh, and though she tried to maintain an air of politeness, the subtle undertones of racism were there for anyone paying attention. Lauren's discrimination wasn't just about class. There was a deeper assumption, based on James's modest appearance, that he was out of place. He wasn't the kind of person who deserved respect, or at least not the same respect she showed others. To her, his calmness, his refusal to know his place, made him even more of a target. The passengers around them began to stir, sensing the tension. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman seated just a few rows ahead leaned over to her friend and whispered, "What's going on?" "She's being so rude to him." A businessman seated nearby glanced up, his brow furrowed at the exchange. He didn't know what was happening, but he could feel the weight of the conversation. His instincts told him that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. There was something wrong with how Lauren was treating James, and it made him uncomfortable. But like most people, he chose to stay out of it, hoping the situation would resolve itself. Lauren, however, was determined to make James move. "If you don't relocate to the back, I will have to involve security," she said, her voice rising just enough for the other passengers to hear. "This is non-negotiable." James leaned back in his seat slightly, unperturbed by her threat. "Call security," he said, his voice measured. "I'm not going anywhere." Her grip on control was slipping. Lauren didn't know how to handle this. She wasn't used to passengers who didn't submit to her authority. She had always been able to make people follow the rules, especially those who didn't fit her idea of what a proper passenger should look like. James was different, and it made her uneasy. She wanted to impose her will on him, but his steadfast calmness only made her more frustrated. James's words were like a mirror, reflecting her own assumptions back at her. His refusal wasn't just a challenge to her authority. It was a reminder that her judgments were based on appearances and biases, not facts. And that realization made her angry. The last thing she wanted was to be seen as someone who couldn't enforce her own rules. The tension between them was thick, palpable. The other passengers were growing more uncomfortable by the second. They could feel it. This was no longer just about a seat assignment. This was a moment of reckoning. The quiet battle between James and Lauren wasn't just a disagreement over seating. It was about power, race, and respect. But still, no one spoke up. The cabin remained silent. The uncomfortable whispers, the only sound that punctuated the heavy atmosphere. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Lauren's frustration was growing. She had always prided herself on controlling every situation on the plane, making sure that everything went according to her rules. But James, this calm, resolute man, was testing her authority in a way no one ever had before. And what frustrated her even more was that he didn't seem to care. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Lauren asked, her voice a little shakier than before, but still carrying the force of her usual control. Her eyes flicked around the cabin, silently daring anyone to intervene. She needed this to end, needed James to back down. But James remained calm, his expression unchanged. "I've already told you, I'm not moving," he replied simply, his tone still smooth and firm. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show signs of anger. He was, as always, in complete control of his emotions. And that, more than anything, was beginning to unsettle Lauren. She wasn't used to passengers refusing her, especially not when they seemed so sure of themselves. It was one thing when a passenger was confused or unaware of the rules, but James knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't backing down because he knew his rights, and that infuriated Lauren even more. The murmur of the cabin grew louder, though only slightly. The passengers around them began to shift in their seats, eyes darting between James and Lauren. Some pretended not to notice, but others were watching closely, silently wondering how this would play out. The discomfort was spreading through the cabin like wildfire. Lauren's gaze flicked toward Grace, the junior flight attendant who had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of what to do. She could see the hesitation in Grace's eyes, the clear discomfort with how things were escalating. Lauren had noticed the young woman's hesitation earlier, and it only made her more agitated. Grace wasn't supposed to question her. She was supposed to help enforce the rules. "Grace!" Lauren snapped, her voice sharp. "Escort him to the back, now!" Grace flinched at the order, glancing between Lauren and James. She had heard the quiet tension in Lauren's voice, and it unsettled her. She knew what Lauren wanted her to do, but she wasn't sure she could carry it out without questioning the fairness of it all. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting nervously, but before she could speak, Lauren's glare sharpened. "Go!" Lauren ordered again, her voice low and dangerous. Grace took a deep breath, nodded reluctantly, and stepped forward. But as she moved toward James, a sense of quiet rebellion seemed to hang in the air. It was as if James's stillness had some sort of power, making Grace pause even longer. She wasn't sure why, but something about this entire situation didn't feel right. James noticed her hesitation. He looked at Grace, then back at Lauren, and for the first time a flicker of something stronger than calm crossed his face. His eyes were steady, but now filled with quiet authority. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, but the weight of his words was clear. Grace hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable, her mind torn between doing what Lauren had commanded and listening to her own conscience. But before she could act, Lauren stepped in front of her, blocking her path with a firm stance. "Grace," Lauren said, her tone now ice-cold. "Do it." Grace swallowed hard. She had always followed orders, but today felt different. The injustice was too stark, too obvious. She felt her body freeze, torn between her fear of crossing Lauren and the quiet voice inside her, telling her this wasn't right. Meanwhile, the murmurs of the passengers were growing louder. Some were shaking their heads, some were starting to whisper to each other. A few had begun to pull out their phones, quietly recording the escalating scene. No one was speaking up, but the tide was turning. People were starting to see what was happening, starting to realize that the treatment of James was not just unfair, it was a direct result of racial prejudice. Lauren's eyes flicked nervously from James to Grace, then to the passengers around her. She knew she was losing control, and that frightened her. But she wouldn't back down. Not now. Not with everyone watching. "Move him now!" Lauren barked, her voice louder than before, tinged with desperation. But James remained unmoved. His gaze was steady, unwavering. "You can keep calling security. You can keep trying to force me out of this seat," he said quietly, "but you won't win this. You're wrong, Lauren. You're wrong, and deep down, you know it." The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. For the first time, Lauren's face faltered. The passengers around them, who had been quiet until now, seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how she would react. Lauren's confidence was beginning to crack. She could feel the weight of the situation shifting, and it wasn't in her favor. James hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even become defensive, but his words were like a mirror to her behavior. They made her uncomfortable in a way that her usual tactics never had. And now, for the first time, she was questioning herself. Was this really about the seat? Or was it something deeper, something she wasn't willing to confront? The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. What had started as a minor dispute over seating was now a spectacle, one that no one seemed able to ignore. The passengers who had been quietly observing now seemed more aware of the injustice taking place. Some were still pretending not to notice, but others were beginning to murmur among themselves. The tension was palpable, and the air crackled with anticipation. Lauren stood rigid, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes flashing with frustration. She was determined to make an example of James, to force him to follow the rules, but every attempt to regain control of the situation had failed. James, however calm and composed, wasn't going anywhere. Grace, still standing near James, glanced nervously between the two of them. She felt like a spectator in a drama she wasn't prepared for. She had followed orders without question for years, but this felt different. It wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about something much deeper. She could feel the weight of the entire cabin watching her, their eyes full of silent judgment. What was she supposed to do? Side with Lauren? or acknowledge the unfairness of the situation? James glanced at her, his voice quiet but firm. Grace, you don't have to do this. You're not a part of this. Grace's heart raced, her hands trembling as she held the passenger list. She had been tasked with carrying out Lauren's orders, but she could feel herself waver. The weight of the moment, the quiet strength in James's voice, the growing discomfort of the passengers around her, it was all too much. She couldn't pretend anymore. But just as she opened her mouth to say something, the cabin door at the front of the plane opened. The pilot, his face pale and tight, stepped into the aisle. His eyes scanned the cabin briefly before his gaze landed on Lauren. Lauren straightened, her expression hardening. She didn't need the pilot to intervene. She had everything under control. But when the pilot walked toward her, his pace quickened, and there was something in his posture that made her uneasy. Lauren, the pilot said, his voice strained, I need to speak with you. Lauren's eyes narrowed. I'm busy right now, she replied sharply, her voice laced with irritation. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now, not when James was still defying her. But the pilot didn't seem fazed. He stepped closer, his tone more insistent. I need to speak with you now. James watched the exchange with quiet interest, sensing that something was about to shift. He had known this moment would come, the moment when the truth would no longer be hidden. He had been patient, allowing Lauren to make her assumptions, to expose her biases. But now it was time to end this. The pilot paused in front of Lauren. The owner of the plane is on board, he said, his voice steady but filled with a note of urgency. And it's Mr. Williams. The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. Lauren blinked, her mind racing as she processed what she had just heard. She turned to look at James, her face paling. The realization hit her like a physical blow. James, who she had dismissed so casually, was the owner of the plane. The one person whose authority trumped everything she had worked so hard to enforce. The unease in her stomach intensified as her earlier condescension came rushing back to her in waves. The man she had so easily written off, the one she had assumed didn't belong in this section of the plane, was the very reason she had a job in the first place. James didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to make any dramatic gestures. His calm, unwavering presence was enough. He had already made his point. Lauren had judged him based on his appearance, had assumed that because of his modest attire and demeanor, he didn't belong. And now, with a single word from the pilot, everything had changed. Lauren's face turned crimson with embarrassment, and she stammered, her usual confidence slipping away. I didn't know, she said weakly, her voice trembling. I didn't know. James nodded slowly, the weight of his silence more powerful than any rebuke. He didn't need to say anything else. The damage was already done. He had been patient long enough, and now it was clear that Lauren's assumptions had led her astray. She had failed to treat him with the respect he deserved, and the consequences of that failure were now impossible to ignore. Around them, the other passengers were starting to react. Whispers rippled through the cabin, some gasping in disbelief, others shaking their heads at Lauren's behavior. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had been a tense confrontation was now a moment of uncomfortable truth. The passengers who had once been passive observers were now silently taking sides. Lauren stood frozen, her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't meet James's eyes, couldn't even look at the pilot, who was waiting for her response. The authority she had once commanded seemed to evaporate in the wake of her mistake. James didn't let the moment linger. I'll be fine, he said, his voice soft but firm. You've made your decision. Now I'll make mine. The pilot nodded, his expression grim. I'm afraid I'll need to speak with the management about this, he said to Lauren, his voice low. This will need to be addressed immediately. Lauren opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The realization that she had been wrong hit her like a hammer, and for the first time, Lauren felt completely powerless. The silence in the cabin was deafening, and as James leaned back in his seat, calm and collected, it became clear that the power had shifted. The question now wasn't about who belonged in this section. It was about who had the real authority on this flight. And Lauren had learned the hard way that it was not her. The tension in the cabin had reached its peak, and now, with the truth out in the open, it seemed to dissipate as quickly as it had appeared. The passengers, once silently uncomfortable, now seemed to come to life. The realization that James was not just any passenger, but the owner of the plane and the airline, had shifted everything. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation over seating had turned into an unspoken lesson in respect, authority, and dignity. Lauren stood there, still frozen, her face pale with shame. Her mind raced, struggling to process the weight of her mistake. She had judged James based on his appearance, assumed he didn't belong in this section because of his modest attire, and in doing so, she had humiliated herself, exposed her own prejudices for everyone to see. But it was too late for apologies, too late for explanations. The damage was done, and now the only thing left was the inevitable fallout. The pilot stepped aside, allowing the cabin to return to a fragile peace. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. It was as if the weight of the moment had rendered them all speechless. They had witnessed something powerful, something that went beyond the discomfort of a simple seating dispute. This was a moment of reckoning, a reminder of how easy it was to fall into assumptions and how damaging those assumptions could be. James leaned back in his seat, his posture as calm and composed as ever. He wasn't angry, wasn't upset. He had known this moment would come, and though he hadn't planned it, the way it had unfolded was a perfect illustration of the point he had been trying to make. The way people, especially people like Lauren, were so quick to judge others based on appearances, based on their assumptions of who they thought people were, had always bothered him. As the plane continued its flight, the atmosphere gradually lightened, though there was still an underlying tension. Lauren had disappeared into the back of the plane, and the murmurs of the passengers began to subside. Some whispered about what had just happened. Others seemed unsure of how to process it. One thing was clear: this would be a moment they wouldn't forget. Grace, the junior flight attendant, who had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, approached James's seat quietly, her demeanor more subdued than usual. She had witnessed the entire situation unfold, had felt the weight of her own hesitation earlier, but now, standing before James, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. "I'm so sorry," Grace said softly, her voice full of sincerity. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get involved." James looked up at her, his expression still calm, but now with a touch of kindness. "You did what you could," he said, his voice reassuring. "The important thing is that you recognize the situation for what it was. Not everyone does." Grace nodded, visibly relieved by his understanding. She had feared that her inaction would cost her, but now hearing his words, she felt validated. This moment, this lesson, had affected her more deeply than she had realized. It wasn't just about what happened between James and Lauren, it was about her own role in it. She had learned something invaluable today, something she would carry with her moving forward. Meanwhile, Lauren, in the back of the plane, was dealing with her own repercussions. She had been dismissed from her duties in order to stay out of sight until the flight landed. Her mind raced as she replayed the scene over and over in her head. She had acted out of assumption, out of prejudice, and now she was paying the price. But what stung the most was the realization that she had been wrong, deeply wrong. And for someone like her, who had prided herself on control and authority, that was a hard pill to swallow. As the flight continued, James glanced out the window, his thoughts far from the turbulence of the past hour. He was no stranger to prejudice. He had lived with it his whole life. But today, something had changed. He had spoken up, stood firm in his dignity, and in doing so, had made a powerful statement without ever needing to raise his voice. The passengers on this flight would likely never forget what they had witnessed. Not just the conflict, but the quiet strength of a man who refused to let someone's assumptions define him. The plane descended smoothly, the hum of the engines accompanying the final leg of the journey. As it touched down, the usual sense of finality filled the cabin. The momentary tension had lifted, but it left behind something more lasting. James stood, gathering his things, his expression still one of quiet authority. As he walked down the aisle toward the exit, he gave a slight nod to Grace, who smiled back at him, the weight of the day still fresh in her mind. When James stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, the fresh air greeted him like a cleansing breeze. His assistants were waiting for him, their faces calm and professional as they briefed him on his next meetings. But for a brief moment, James allowed himself to reflect on what had just happened. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been unfairly judged, who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And in that moment, as the plane continued on its journey, he realized that sometimes the most powerful victories were not those that came from confrontation, but from the quiet moments of truth that shifted everything.